there's a prominent trend that's been happening over the past year and years that podcasts are becoming important vehicles for the creation of micro communities of fans, and these are creating connections between those who listen and those who speak.
I would say that podcasting of course, it's an old media. I would say it's an old media, even if its life is kind of bizarre because it started 10 years before, very slowly, very silentful, and for no reason, and maybe some. It just exploded, and we are talking and again. So we see a very interesting, growing audience for podcasts. So, of course, when you want to propose such big content, then podcast is on your road.
So when did you start getting into it yourself? And what are you learning from what's been happening kind of in the past and more recently?
I have been interviewing people since, I don't know, for 16, 17 years. And writing for magazines or newspapers, there's always a lot of stuff that gets cut. And in any interview, I have to throw away most of the conversation. And I like the idea of having a format like Mark Maron's format that's a long-form conversation with lots of highs and lows, but where it gets to somewhere, ideally it gets to somewhere real. And I think that's what attracts me to podcasting. And then there's the part that I've never been on the radio or anything. I do not have a very polished voice. I don't know how to speak. I just started recording things and putting them online, and that's part of the appeal too.
What I like is the focus on sound, and it's a bit like reading a book over watching a film. It leaves a lot to imagination, and also it's a very accessible form of expression. So and you can do, it's like music in the sense that you can do so many other things at the same time and let your mind wander. So that was something that really attracted me to podcast. I mean, to radio before, and on the podcasting side, as a consumer, it's more the fact that you don't have that much advertising, you don't have to wait, and you can just basically say, oh, I want to listen to this person's voice.
Why we feel like podcasts are sort of having a moment right now?
I've noticed something really interesting in terms of the explosion of podcasts and people launching their podcasts in the non-music field. It's basically people who've, like minorities and activists who found their voice on Twitter and now actually using the podcast and turning to podcasts as the main form of expression because they've built their following, and we can probably mention this again later on in conversation, but they've built a following, and it's like a natural extension to like tweeting and stuff because it's how they can kind of, gain back the means, the channeling of where they're actually communicating because they're producing that content and they're not just hosting it somewhere on a platform. And I think that's a really interesting thing that we can like follow through in terms of how we apply that to artists or how artists apply that to themselves.
I think the talk is the main engine of the podcast. People want to hear something, to have an opinion, to have an advice, or a human.
Absolutely.
You have this experience with Spotify, and it's really interesting that we are in between the Spotify aspect on demand and the human, I would say, of the radio stations.
Absolutely.
So this is very particular, and this is because it is in the middle of all that. It's focusing the attention.
What do you guys see out there that artists and labels that are successfully building podcasting into their strategy right now?
It's not a marketing tool. So we see some artists are very excited with that and is starting, but the problem is you have to feed the machine with something from the heart or from somewhere, but not only superficially. It doesn't work at all. And the expectation of the public is to have another kind of relationship with the artist. So the artists have to be deeply involved in this process.
I noticed something is that I read that a few years ago, maybe one or more, there was this talk about major labels, really seeing the potential in podcasts. And I haven't seen any yet. And I think that's really interesting and quite telling. If artists express themselves as like through music, that's one thing. But if they have to then also be that savvy in terms of other forms is not a given. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, what's interesting is that you can actually start these conversations quite easily. The question is, how do you maintain these conversations, and how do you know when to end that conversation? Because that's also important. And that circles back to a notion which I think is key in how to understand what could work or what could not work. It's the notion of scarcity. Mm-hmm. Meaning that if ever, be it like in terms of the offer, in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of how you are compared to others, and also if everyone is doing the same kind of thing, not only is it not really relevant, but also the artist will not want to do that, because the whole point of the artist is to express themselves as they are.
No, actually, my first guest was one of the first guest on my podcast in 2015. He was one of our country's biggest rappers, and he does have a podcast now with 2 other people.
Este é o primeiro episódio do Até Tenho a Minha Inscrição. Eu no início da semana passada fui a Chelas, ao Quarto Mágico, falar com o Sam daqui.
Eu tenho vontade de fazer isso com rappers, estás a ver? Fazer longas entrevistas, perguntas que nunca ninguém lhes vai fazer, porque eu sei o que eles pensam.
I also don't know many examples of podcasts hosted by musicians in Portugal, and I've always had some difficulty getting to a few artists that I don't know personally, that I haven't interviewed in another professional capacity before, or who I don't know in any way, to get them on my podcast, because they are still a bit, I don't know, wary, or they think that it maybe doesn't matter getting to. It's always difficult access, because there's always layers and layers of managers and agents.
One example which I thought was interesting is a French artist called Isolde, and she's just launched a podcast, and it's around a whole message. And what's interesting, and she's on her 3rd episode, and she does it on YouTube. But what's interesting is she basically starts the first episode saying, "I've decided to express myself outside of music. I'm doing this to basically be like, you're in my bedroom. This is super intimate," which is a theme in like what she's been developing, because she used to be on a major label. That's the context. And now she's like, I'm free and I'm super vulnerable and I'm ready to talk about like my body issues, my mental health, and like it's a whole big thing. And another thing she says is, I'm also hoping to, change and change my views on things, and I'm not here just to be like saying this. So I think that's quite interesting, and she's one of the rare artists who's actually doing this in France.
Where are we seeing audiences spending their time to consume podcasts right now?
So in terms of consumption, what's also interesting on the stats is that you have basically half of it's mobile, and a third is about computers, like desktops. Which is interesting, because it shows that people tend to listen to this podcast when they're on the go.
I think we are lacking a lot of information, but what I can say that 1/3 of the audience is made on the website.
Interesting.
Yeah, 1/3 is made on mobile, and 1/3 is made on OTT, smart TV.
Yeah,
because we have plenty of partners on the telcos in Europe and outside. So we see that at home is also a big place for radio and podcast.
But with the pandemic, when you look at global figures, you've noticed that podcast listening kind of went down. Radio exploded, especially on like information channels, and then people kind of got their bearings a bit, and then it's gone back to like it was. So basically, podcast consumption evolved during the pandemic, or the beginnings of the lockdown, the way music consumption, which was interesting in terms of parallels.
What you guys are using as definition of success?
I like when people drop that facade and they're not, they're just talking. I prefer conversations to interviews.
Sure.
Though I also like interviews, and when I have to do interviews, I do interviews, I prefer for them, but I like the spontaneity of conversation.
Yeah.
And I like not necessarily having those people talk about what they are trying to promote.
Yes, but I think it's also interesting to think about artists who present, one identity for, in the marketplace in, live or on stage or on album or whatever else it might be, and that they do have the freedom to present sort of an extension of their persona in a slightly different lens in this channel as a very valuable asset.
The freedom of artistic expression is, I think, the most alluring aspect of podcasting for artists. Then I think there's also the fact that whichever podcast you start, your goals are linked to what are you doing this for in terms of strategy? Is it to express yourself? Is it because you're looking for like engagement KPIs? Are you looking for like new fans? Are you working on your brand? Or are you just doing it as something like just trying something, experimenting? If ever you are into actually incorporating a podcast into like your official strategy, which is still very unusual to do and very, pro in terms of, approach, then it has to see how that format, just like as any other format, will actually bring something new to the table and allow you to like be very clear on what are your main goals. If you don't know what your main goals are, you have no point in doing a format just because no one's done it before and like mathematically you're going to stand out. But if you stand out mathematically and it's terrible, I don't think it's a good strategy. It's a really good medium to like continue the engagement with fans and like on a different, maybe deeper level. And obviously it will indirectly or more or less directly generate ticketing, merch, you name it, like different ways of having a, artist fan experience.
It's something that should be very natural. Some people prefer Instagram. It's another relationship, but it could be very creative, people sharing something. So do it for sharing something.